Hi, this is Amanda Alessi, Naturalist at the Great Plains Nature Center. And today I'm going to be sharing about who's who in your compost bin. And while decomposers are going to be the first thing that come to mind, there are a whole lot of other organisms that live in the compost bin, that live in compost. And it's super fascinating. And so it's basically the whole food pyramid, a whole system that lives within the compost bin and live together off of each other. So we're going to start off taking a look at the food pyramid, and at the base of this pyramid you can see our organic residues. So these are the things that we're hoping to compost. So if you compost food scraps or garden, stuff from your garden and tree limbs, things like that, that is at the base of our food pyramid. And then we've got primary consumers who feed on those residues, secondary consumers, they eat primary consumers, and then tertiary consumers will eat secondary consumers and even some primary consumers. So that is basically what we're going to be looking at today in our who's who in your compost bin. So those organic residues are filled up of things such as your leaves, grass clippings, other plant debris, your food scraps, and animal waste and animal bodies. So you think about everything's living in here, and so their waste has to go somewhere, and if an animal dies, it's there. But that is all of the debris and the waste that is getting composted in the bin. So that is the base of the food pyramid. So the primary consumers, these are the animals that feed directly, not just animals, these are the organisms that feed directly on dead plants and animals. Here we go. All right, fungus and bacteria and actinobacteria. So fungi do not photosynthesize. They are similar to animals in that they are heterotrophs. They get their food from somewhere else. They don't produce their own food the way plants do. So they get their food by absorbing dissolved molecules, typically by secreting digestive enzymes into their environment. And we also have bacteria in this group. There are typically 40 million bacterial cells in 1 gram of soil. And then there are actinobacteria. So these are of great economic importance because agriculture and forests depend on their contributions to the soil. So in the soil, they behave much like a fungi. They help to decompose the organic matter of dead organisms so that the molecules can then be taken up by new plants. Some actinobacteria live symbiotically with the plants whose roots are in the soil. And they fix nitrogen for the plants in exchange for access to some of the plants' nutrients. Slugs, snails, and earthworms. So slugs and snails are gastropods. And gastro means stomach, and pod means foot. So if you look at our diagram here of a slug, their foot is here. They have one long foot that they get around on, and their mouth is actually on the bottom of their foot. And inside that mouth, they have this really cool tongue that's called a radula, and it's got hooks and barbs on it, and they kind of scrape as they go along. And during development, gastropods go through this anatomical process called torsion, where everything kind of rotates 180 degrees to one side. And what this does is this puts their anus situated on top of their head, which is just kind of unusual and tricky when you think about breathing and going to the bathroom at the same time. You don't want those two things to be next to each other, but it works out for the slugs and the snails. They do have 2 or 4 sensory tentacles with eyes that can be inverted. And then earthworms. Lovely earthworms. Go out, find them, get dirty, dig around and look for them. They're segmented worms. Earthworms are commonly found in living soil and feeding on live and dead organic matter. This is usually the first thing that we think of when we think of things being decomposed is the work of these earthworms. So next in this level are isopods. So this would be woodlice, millipedes, beetles, millipedes and beetle mites. So an isopod is a crustacean. So these roly-polies here, they are crustaceans, and that means they're really closely related to like lobsters and crayfish. So they have gills on their belly. They have to be moist to breathe. If you want to hear more about isopods, because I could talk a lot about them, that's my favorite podcast episodes. So I'll try not to go on too long here, but they're pretty cool. They've got rigid, segmented, long exoskeletons. They have 14 jointed legs that are all the same. And they mostly feed on dead plant material, and they're usually active at night. So some woodlice in the genus Armadillidium, those are the ones that can roll into almost a perfect ball, hence the name pillbug or roly-poly. And there's another genus that they can't quite get rolled all the way into a ball. Millipedes. Whoa. There we go. All right. So millipedes are arthropods that have 2 pairs of jointed legs per segment. Most millipedes have very elongated cylindrical bodies with more than 20 segments. As you can see, this picture of this millipede here is very cylindrical, and you can kind of see right in here that there are pairs of legs per segment. Most millipedes are slow moving, and they're detritivores, which means they eat decaying plant matter and other dead plant matter, stuff like that. So some eat fungi and some suck on plant fluids. And then we have the beetle mite. So this family of beetles is known as carrion beetles, and they feed on decaying organic matter such as dead animals. All right, black soldier fly and green June beetle grub. The black soldier fly. So this guy is widespread, harmless, and is actually a very beneficial insect. Black soldier flies cannot bite or sting, unlike pest flies, and they are not vectors of human disease. And this is a result of their pretty unique life cycle. So adults, they only live for a few days for the purpose of mating, and therefore they don't migrate between different waste matter, which aids in spreading disease. So they don't go from one section to another. They don't have time to travel that far, as pest flies do. And their larvae can live for several weeks, and during that time they consume huge quantities of waste or manure. So these guys are very well suited to process, the constant waste that's in a compost bin. Good guys to have around. And the green June beetle grub. So this larvae feed largely on humus and mold, but they can do considerable damage to plant root systems. All right. I think we're heading to our secondary consumers now. Ta-da! So secondary consumers are organisms that eat primary consumers. So again, these are not necessarily the decomposers. These are guys that help that ecosystem in the compost pile. They keep everything going. And so these guys are going to keep the primary consumers in check. So nematodes and protozoa. There's a better picture. All right. Nematodes are roundworms, and there are so many millions of nematodes per square meter. There's just They have diversity of life cycles, they're at various trophic levels, and they play an important role in many ecosystems. There's a nematologist named Nathan Cobb who described their presence like this, and so this is going to be a quote from Nathan Cobb. "In short, if all the matter in the universe except the nematodes were swept away, our world would still be dimly recognizable, and if, as disembodied spirits, we could then investigate it, we should find its mountains, hills, vales, rivers, lakes, and oceans represented by a film of nematodes. The location of towns would be decipherable, since every massing of human beings there would be a corresponding massing of certain nematodes. Trees would still stand in ghostly rows representing our streets and highways. The location of the various plants and animals would still be decipherable, and, had we sufficient knowledge, in many cases, even their species could be determined by an examination of their erstwhile nematode parasites." So that's how many nematodes there are, and how they're everywhere. So while these guys do not decompose organic matter, they are parasitic, and they're free-living organisms that feed on living material. And they actually have an effective role in regulating the bacteria population. And protozoa. So these guys are single-celled organisms that behave kind of like animals. They can move around, and they exhibit predation, so they're predators. So they occupy a range of trophic levels. They can include both herbivores and consumers in the decomposer link of the food chain. And they also control bacteria populations as well. On average, one protozoa can eat about 100 to 1,000 bacteria per hour. They can stimulate decomposition of organic matter, digest cellulose in the rumen of cows, and termite guts. And the mold mite is next. Let's find the mold mite. Here we go. Isn't he cute? There we go. That's so cool. They feed on fungi. I think that's all I got about the mold mite. But that looks like an electron microscope picture there. Very cool. And we're down to the springtails. Springtails are super cool. So though these guys have 6 legs, they are not insects. They have internal mouth parts where insects have external mouth parts. They are omnivorous, and they're free-living. They prefer moist conditions. They can actually dry out pretty quickly. And while they don't directly decompose, they're not decomposers. They contribute to the compost pile and decomposing items in that they kind of fragment organic matter and control the soil microbial communities. So they just kind of help keep everything in check and break stuff down into tinier pieces, and that will aid in the decomposition. And for your viewing pleasure, we have a YouTube video.
They're tiny. This minute little creature is a springtail. It's less than 0.5 millimeter long, the size of a full stop. In 1 square meter of soil, there may be over 10,000 of them. Drying out is a very real danger for them, and some waterproof themselves regularly with a droplet of special grooming fluid. You might even say that they have turned bathing into an art form. They even have 2 inflatable tubes that enable them to get to those hard-to-reach places. To help them get around through the leaf litter, these springtails, as their name suggests, have a rather novel way of jumping. They have a tiny 2-pronged lever beneath their abdomen. One small flick from it can catapult them 6 inches, some 15 centimeters, into the air. It's the equivalent of a human being jumping over the Eiffel Tower. And if they happen to land upside down, well, they have a special way of righting themselves. They use their grooming fluid dispenser to stick onto the ground so that they can pull themselves back onto their feet.
All right. I've watched that video so many times. I love it. So now we are on our tertiary consumers. So these guys were getting up to the top of that food pyramid. Tertiary consumers eat secondary consumers, basically. So these are our predators. So we're going to first talk about centipedes. So centipedes are elongated and usually kind of flattened with one pair of legs per body segment. So they're often confused, centipedes and millipedes. But as you can see here, one pair of legs per body segment that you can see. Centipedes are known to be venomous, and they can often inject like a venom that's can be paralyzing, and they're predominantly carnivorous. And they always have an odd number of pairs of legs. Rove beetles. Kind of a cool looking dude. So rove beetles are primarily distinguished by their short wing covers that typically leave more than half of their abdomens exposed. And you can see this is that short wing cover, and here is their exposed abdomen. So that is not typical when you're thinking of beetles. Most rove beetles are predators of insects and other invertebrates living in forest leaf litter and similar decaying plant matter. One of the largest rove beetles in Kansas is associated with fungi, and it feeds on insects. And there's another Kansas rove beetle that's associated with carrion. And while it does not feed on the carrion itself, it eats the fly maggots that are in the carrion. This is one of the more common beetles found at carrion. And there you have it. So that is who's who in your compost bin. I hope you enjoyed just diving in and getting to know these guys, just a little bit of what's going on in your compost bin. It's more than earthworms. So my name's Amanda, naturalist here at the Great Plains Nature Center, and thank you for joining me.